I start with the ending because that is where the noise stopped and the record began, with the trainer's clip taken down by the platform, a signed no contact order in my file, a policy memo from the gym banning filming without consent, and a resignation notice with his name on it. My business stayed intact, my clients renewed, and a trade group asked me to teach calm steps under bright lights. So the outcome is simple to say, even if it was hard to earn. I kept my voice steady, gathered originals, and let paper do the loud work while pride stayed silent. The part before that looks messy from far away. A crowded floor with mirrors, phones everywhere. A young man trying to stage a show, and my wife standing still while he told me to walk out. But I did not take the bait. I stepped back, kept my hands open, and pointed my chin at the ceiling camera because timestamps hold better than anger. The hours after brought a short edit that cut out his touch and left my posture as the frame for a lie. But I answered with preservation letters, a visit to the DVR room, a clean chain of custody, and a slow map that linked edits to a handle he used for ads. By the time we sat in a fluorescent room and signed terms, I understood that dignity returns the same way it leaves, one small choice at a time, written down and kept. I walked into PowerForge with my boots still dusty from a site job, and I knew the air had turned into a stage before I reached the racks, because phones were already pointed and music covered the edges of common sense. So I did the one thing that keeps a man steady under lights. I slowed my breathing and kept my hands open. The trainer lifted his chin and tried to move me with his shoulder, and I stepped back so the dome camera would see space between us. Then I pointed my chin at the lens and at the tripods because time matters more than pride. And when my wife folded her arms and stayed still, I felt the ground inside my chest tilt. But I held the line and told myself the first win tonight would be the absence of a scene with sound. Bites. I walked to the desk and asked for a manager, noted his name, and read the small sign over the DVR cage that listed a retention window of 21 days. And I wrote that number in my phone with the date because numbers decay when you let them sit only in memory. At home, I took a legal pad and divided it into 4 boxes: gym angles, witness names, platform links, client updates, and I filled each box with simple lines that a tired judge could read in a minute. Then I sent a short message to my attorney with the model number from the DVR and the timestamps I had seen on the wall monitor. By sunrise, the first cut of the clip showed up with my open palms as the frame for a lie and a caption that turned restraint into threat. And I did not argue under it because arguing helps the clip breathe. Instead, I drove straight to the gym at opening and asked for corporate contact. And when the desk clerk told me to email a form, I smiled, took the form, and still wrote down his badge number because every chain starts with a single link. My attorney sent preservation letters before lunch and added a spoliation warning that turned the casual air in the back office into careful air, and the regional manager met me by the DVR with a tight mouth that said he finally understood the risk, and he burned the night's angles to 2 encrypted drives while the system printed a log like a calm heartbeat. Then he signed chain forms with a steady pen and slid 1 copy across the table so the dates would not become a rumor. I left with the drives in a padded sleeve and stopped at the station to file a harassment report that listed the contact on my shoulder and the follow to the door, and I handed over 1 drive with the chain form so the evidence would live in 2 places if 1 box ever vanished. At home, I opened a clean folder labeled Household Evidence and added bank statements that showed new athletic wear on nights she called late shifts, and I exported camera logs that did not match her calendar because pattern tells a story that words try to hide. And when a client texted to ask if I was safe, I answered in plain lines with the report number and a promise that our schedule would not slip, since the best way to fix a name is to keep doing the work that name was built on. Nina met me in a glass room that looked like a clean lab, and I placed the drive, the chain forms, the system log, and my written timeline on the table. Then I sat with my hands still while she read each page and marked the edges with tabs so a judge could find the spine of the story in seconds. And she laid out a plan that moved like steady gears. First, the platform notices with specific links and timestamps. Then the harassment intake with the officer's number. Then the gym demand for policy, enforcement and retention of all raw angles. And finally, a draft complaint for false light and defamation held in reserve until the platform finished review. And she asked me to send a simple client letter that used numbers rather than emotions, so I wrote one that listed the case number, the preservation notices, and a promise to keep every appointment. Corporate called that afternoon, and the regional manager invited me to walk the floor with him, and I watched him see the problem with new eyes. Because the tripods, the mirror zones, and the lack of staff intervention looked different after a lawyer's letter, and he printed policy sheets that said no filming without consent and zero harassment. And he signed a note that the policy would be retrained to staff by a fixed date, and I filed those pages under gym compliance because paper should travel in named folders. Evan began the forensic map and sent a short preview that showed audio drag and 6 hard cuts with time gaps that lined up with the moment his hand touched my shoulder, and I felt the small relief that arrives when facts start to speak in their own language. And I drove home and found a post from Diana that talked about peace and privacy and said nothing about the edit. And I wrote the text in my log without comment, because the record matters and my feelings do not. She asked that night if I could slow the legal steps for the sake of her job, and I wrote that request word for word next to the case number. Then I went to bed with the drive copy sealed in a fireproof pouch because redundancy is a quiet kind of courage. The counselor visit the next day confirmed what I already knew, since the conversation centered on optics and fatigue rather than consent and policy, and when I asked if she ever gave written consent to be filmed on a public floor, she answered with a line about how everyone records now, and I wrote the phrase everyone records and the time in the margin because phrases that avoid responsibility often repeat. PD called after lunch to say a parent had forwarded chat screenshots where the trainer bragged about making me leave the frame, and I forwarded them to Nina and logged the file names so nothing would drift. And the platform wrote in the evening to say the clip was hidden while reviewers assessed our packet, and I breathed out for the first time since the floor mirrors. Then I printed a separation draft that protected my business goodwill, added mutual non-disparagement, and barred third-party harassment through associates and fans, and I placed it on the kitchen table under a pen, because signatures are the only answers I respect now. The charity 5K arrived on a cool morning, and I chose a plain shirt and quiet shoes because I wanted no stage, only proof. And I walked the sponsor row once to note cameras, badge scanners, and the tent where the gym had set up a table. Then I texted Nina that I was on site and found a spot with clean sightlines. The trainer came with 2 men carrying gimbals and a smile built for mirrors, and the process server moved like a shadow from a film I had seen before and handed him the packet beside. The sponsor banner so the time, place, and logo would anchor the moment, and the men with rigs lowered their gear a little because paper does that to people. It changes the air from play to record. Diana stood near the bank tent and held a smile that looked borrowed from a brochure, and I read it as a request for a scene I refused to give. So I shook a client's hand and talked about a site survey and left the rest to the envelope. Nina texted that his counsel had called to say he was only nearby, and she replied with stills from the mirror angle and a short note about audio drift and cut points. And I added the badge scan from the 5K to my log because even small anchors hold when months pass. Evan sent the full forensics report that afternoon, with a neat map that linked each cut to the missing contact and with a hash list that matched the gym drives, and the platform hid the clip and flagged derivatives, and PD logged a simple assault for the shoulder and a harassment referral for the follow. And I wrote the numbers twice in my notebook and once on the inside cover of the case box labeled with his name. Luis from corporate sent a draft memo on no filming without consent and staff duty to intervene, and I asked for a training date and a sign-off sheet, and he sent both, and I filed them under compliance because remedies need shelves. At home, the guest room stayed made, and the kitchen table held the separation draft with a clean pen, and I wrote a short letter to clients that listed the case number, the platform action, and a note that our schedule held firm, and the replies arrived in the plain tone working people use when they choose trust, and I breathed a little easier. The settlement meeting came 2 days later in a room that smelled like sanitizer and paper, and he looked smaller without glass behind him, and his counsel tried the bystander line until Nina slid the edit map, the chain forms, the policy photos, and the chat screenshots, and the room accepted the shape of the truth without noise. And our terms sat on the table in short lines that even a tired clerk could enforce. Full removal of the clip and mirrors, a retraction video with clear language about an edited post that misled viewers, a donation to the Veterans Clinic, a resignation from the gym, and a no contact that included proxies and fans, and we offered a waiver of damages if deadlines were met, and he read the dates and took the pen, and I watched the ink move and felt something in my ribs let go because dignity often returns with simple strokes. The retraction posted at noon on a Tuesday, and I watched it once with the sound low, just enough to hear the simple admission that an edited post misled viewers and that the missing moments changed the scene. Then I saved a copy, closed the tab, and filed the platform confirmation in the case box with the hash list and chain forms because outcomes belong on paper, not in my pulse. An email followed with removal notices for mirrors and shares, and I printed those too. Then a receipt landed from the Veterans Clinic with a transaction number I wrote on a sticky note and pressed to the folder spine. And by mid-afternoon, Luis sent the final policy memo with a clear ban on filming without consent and a requirement that staff step in when away. Situation turns performative, plus a training sign-off sheet with a date I circled so I could check it later. And the last page in that packet was the resignation from the gym in grayscale, which looked smaller than it had felt under mirrors. At home, the separation moved from draft to signatures on a calm morning at a long table, and I initialed each page that kept my business intact and barred both of us from turning sadness into a show for strangers. And when the clerk stamped the last page, I felt the kind of quiet that comes when a door closes without a slam. Then I drove home and swept the garage and labeled 3 bins with simple words, tools, records, keep, because order is the respect you owe your next day. I sent clients a short status note with the PD case number, the platform action, and the policy memo, and replies came back with steady words about schedule and trust, which I logged and filed because trust should be handled like glass. Then I met my team and handed out cards with 4 lines: de-escalate, disengage, document, deliver, and I walked them through the gym floor beat by beat so they could see how a step back and an open hand saved me more than any strong pose would have. And I watched shoulders drop as people understood that dignity is a method, not a mood. I wrote a 1-page SOP called Calm Steps under bright lights and pinned it to our internal page, and a trade group followed with a speaking invite that I accepted, since useful habits should travel to rooms where decisions get made, and I added a new folder in the cabinet called Teaching and Outreach, and placed the invite beside the policy memo because a good day ends with everything shelved. That evening, I sent a thank you note to Sergeant Ruiz for moving the report without drama and to Nina for pushing paper like a steady tide, and I thanked Luis for choosing compliance over clout and asked him to confirm the staff training roster after the date, and he replied with a quiet yes that told me the room had learned something real. I ended the night by moving my shadow box above the cabinet where the case boxes now sit, not as a warning, but as a reminder that a name outlasts noise when a man chooses breath over spectacle and records, each step until the story can stand on its own without him speaking at all. I kept the momentum because momentum keeps truth from sliding back into rumor. So I drove to the gym 1 week later and checked the new signs that banned filming without consent, read the training memo posted by the clock, and photographed the staff sign-off sheet that showed completed dates and initials. Then I asked the manager to print a short incident policy for my file, and he did it without ceremony, which told me the lesson had settled into the room. Corporate sent a letter to their insurer that described the retraining, and I filed the letter under compliance along with a copy of the resignation and the donation receipt. And I added a note to remind myself to check the policy again in 3 months because change needs a calendar, not hope. The trade talk came on a calm morning, and I spoke in plain steps about de-escalate, disengage, document, deliver, and I watched a room of managers copy the 4 words onto index cards. And after the session, a young coach with a worried face said he had learned to put phones down first and hands open second, and I thought that was a good order for a life. PD closed the case as compliant with conditions met and left a note that future checks could reference the retraction and the no contact stipulation, so I placed the closure in the box and wrote the case number on the spine for easy pull. Then I called 2 clients who had waited for the outcome and thanked them for steadiness, and confirmed their audits with dates and tasks. Because confidence is built with punctual work more than with speeches. One night, an anonymous account tried to revive a still frame with a new caption, and Nina filed a fast notice that cited the retraction and the settlement, and the post vanished. Before morning, and I saved the platform message as proof that systems learn when pushed with clean paper. The house found a new rhythm, and I did small things well, like labeling cables, fixing a loose hinge, and cooking simple meals without turning the kitchen into a stage. And I kept the guest room made and the hall clear, not as symbols, but as a map of boundaries that now help me breathe. Diana came by once for a box of books, and we exchanged short words about weather and paperwork in tones. That did not ask for more, and I wrote down the time and a single line that the contact stayed neutral, because the record should not carry feelings when facts are enough. I updated the firm handbook with a page on public incidents and handed my team laminated cards with the 4-step rule plus a short line about calling counsel before pride, and I added a line about gratitude to vendors who know evidence. Then I visited Pete at the bar and left a receipt for the camera upgrade because good tools and good habits keep rooms honest. At dusk, I walked the loop where the streetlights come on in a slow wave, and I practiced the same steady breath I used on the gym floor. And I told myself that this was not a story about a trainer, or a marriage, or a clip. It was a story about a name and the method that kept it intact, and I returned to the office, closed the cabinet where the case boxes sit under the shadow box, and set out tomorrow's files, because the next best outcome always begins with quiet order. A month later, the habit felt natural, so when a subcontractor barked at my junior analyst in a hospital loading bay and a phone appeared in someone's hand, I stepped between them with an open posture, counted a quiet breath, and moved the conversation to the sign-in desk where cameras covered us all without angles for theater. And I wrote the time and place on a small card while the foreman apologized in a flat tone that meant more than any performance. And I filed the card under cite incidents because small frictions test whether a method holds. The trade group talk turned into a short course, and I built modules that walked students through a parking lot, a gym floor, a break room, and a community event. And I made each lesson end with the same 4 steps and a template letter that uses numbers rather than heat. And after the pilot, I received evaluations that said the best part was how calm felt like a tool rather than a feeling, which told me the work now has shape beyond my house. Corporate asked me to review their policy rollout, and I suggested a quarterly audit with anonymous staff feedback and a clear escalation ladder, and they accepted and sent a schedule with sign-offs that I clipped to the compliance folder, and I added a reminder in my calendar to follow up before the window closes, because procedures lose power when they drift into slogans. An email from the Veterans Clinic arrived with a thank you note that listed 2 equipment purchases made with the donation, and I put a copy under the settlement papers because consequences should lead to repair when possible. And that page felt better to file than any victory headline ever could have, since headlines evaporate and repairs stay. Sometimes my mind still ran the old floor through at night like a training tape. And when it did, I let the scene finish and then replaced it with the charity tent and the service packet and the laminated cards on my table, and the weight in my chest eased because a brain trained on risk searches for exits, and my exits now are written and reachable. The platform sent one more automated notice about a mirror upload taken down, and I printed it and slid it behind the others and realized the case box had a satisfying heft that meant I would not need to reopen it, and I labeled the spine with a final date and returned it to the shelf under the shadow box, where finished things belong. Frank asked me to speak to apprentices again, so I stood amid hardy hats and tool belts and told them that a man's name is not defended by volume but by sequence. First breathe, then preserve, then notify, then enforce. And I watched them write it without smirks, which is rarer than most people think. The house kept its steady rhythm, and I learned to leave work at the office by writing tomorrow's 3 lines before I locked the door. And every night I read those lines once so I would sleep with order instead of noise. And I woke early to stretch, cook simple food, and build small shelves that held what mattered: tools, records, keep. And on the newest shelf, I placed the teaching folder. Because the real return on this season is not that a clip went away. It is that a method now lives in other hands, and when I drove past PowerForge on my way to a site, I saw a clerk reminding a member about the no filming rule and pointing to a sign, and he did it gently, like someone who knows he is protecting a room rather than winning a point. And I felt a quiet satisfaction that has no audience and needs none. A quarter turned and the method kept paying dividends. So when a city facility asked for a full camera and conduct audit, I walked their halls with a young supervisor who had printed my 4 words on a card, and we mapped blind corners, posted consent, reminders in shared spaces, and set a small protocol for moments when a phone changes a room. And I felt the quiet pride that comes when a plan becomes normal. Corporate from the gym chain sent a quarterly compliance packet that showed training, rosters, staff quizzes, and a small drop in incident reports after the memo. And I filed it with a note to check again next quarter because momentum without calendars turns into slogans. And I attached a short recommendation to keep reinforcing the intervention step, since that is where good policy often dies. My separation stayed clean, and we exchanged only necessary notes about mail and documents, which I logged with times and simple lines because facts age well when they are written, and I refused bitterness because bitterness steals attention from the work in front of a man, and my work was steady and worth my attention. An attorney from a different gym asked if I would review their floor rules, and I said yes on paper with clear scopes and limits. And I added a respect clause to my contracts that defined filming boundaries and staff duties at client sites. And 2 clients wrote back that they wished they had added that language years ago, so I knew the lesson had moved beyond me. One of the parents from the case sent a note through counsel saying their son had finished community service and a training module about digital harm. And I replied through counsel that I accepted the closure and wished him well because a closed loop keeps a wound from reopening, and I placed the letter behind the settlement pages as a full stop. My team grew more confident with each site incident they handled without heat, and I watched a junior analyst use the card in a hospital vestibule when a visitor tried to film a nurse, and he de-escalated, disengaged, documented, and delivered a short report that the risk committee praised for calm clarity, and I saved his report as a model for the next hire. I visited Pete again to see the new camera mounted at a better angle with a clean date sticker and a fresh cable run, and I left a copy of my guide for small businesses on how to keep chain of custody without fear, and he tucked it near the register like a quiet shield. A trade publication asked for a short piece on evidence under bright lights, and I wrote it like a field memo with steps and checklists rather than stories. And the editor thanked me for giving readers tools instead of heat, and I saved the proofs in the teaching folder under a tab called Outreach because names are kept by service. On a mild Saturday, I cleared the last of the labeled bins in the garage and built a shelf for finished case boxes, and I wrote the dates on each spine and placed them under the shadow box, and I stood there for a minute and felt only the even weight of things in order, which is better than any feeling a crowd can hand you. In the evening, I walked the loop and watched porch lights blink on, and I told myself that this season had been about more than a clip or a gym or a marriage. It had been a test of whether a man can hold his line without raising his voice, and the answer lived in the files, the cards, the policies, and the quiet rooms where people now know what to do when a phone tries to turn life into a stage. The next season brought steady work and a wider circle that cared less about my story and more about the method. So I built a short handbook and printed it in calm fonts that looked like instructions rather than speeches, and I carried copies in my truck the way other men carry tools, because this was my tool now. A hospital network hired me to standardize incident response across 3 campuses, and I spent 2 long days walking halls with their safety chief, marking lens heights, sight lines, and the places where pride turns small friction into spectacle. And we posted consent reminders near waiting rooms and trained reception on how to move a tense talk toward fixed cameras and better light. And after week 1, their report logs started to sound less like storms and more like weather, which is how safety should read. PD closed my file with a neat note that conditions were met and contact limits stood, and I filed the closure behind the settlement and wrote the final date on the box. Spine. Then I returned to the gym chain to sit with their regional staff and read incident quizzes that actually tested understanding rather than memory. And I suggested a mixed scenario that forces a coach to intervene before filming starts, and they added it and sent me a proof, and I kept the proof because copies keep promises. On a quiet morning, Diana texted about a final mail piece, and we exchanged it in the lobby of her bank with the crisp tone of two people who had finished the hard part, and I wrote the time in a single line that the contact stayed neutral. Then I walked outside and breathed air that felt like paper drying in the sun. A subcontractor later called to say a worker had mocked my age during a site audit, and a phone was up, and I answered with the same four words that have carried me. And the manager moved the talk to a covered space with cameras, and the mocker softened because rooms with evidence change men faster than scolding. And I wrote the incident in a small log and shared it at the next huddle as proof that the method does not require a certain temperament, only a sequence. I kept teaching because teaching kept me honest, and I watched young analysts learn to see corners and reflections and shadow lines that betray edits. And I felt the quiet pride that arrives when a student moves a scene away from heat without anyone clapping, because most good work ends without applause. One evening, I drove the long route past the clinic and thought about how money from a bad act had turned into equipment that would help strangers breathe easier. And I decided that was the best kind of consequence. The kind that fixes something outside your house. I still walk past mirrors sometimes and feel the old ache rise like a habit, but I let it pass and replace it with checklists. Because grief can ride with you if you give it a seatbelt, and method is a better passenger than anger. At home, I labeled a new shelf teaching and placed the trade proofs and the index cards there, and I turned off the light with the same even breath I used on the floor that first night. And I knew the story would stay finished because I had given it a spine. And spines stand even when rooms try to bend them. I kept adding small structure because structure makes peace repeatable. So I wrote a quarterly ritual on a card and taped it inside the cabinet door. Review compliance letters, check platform alerts, refresh client SOPs, revisit the 4 steps with the team, and I followed it the way a mechanic follows a maintenance log, simple and regular. And it paid off when a hospital receptionist sent me a note about a tense lobby scene that could have turned into a public mess because she had read our guide and moved the talk to a monitored corridor with better light and a witness, and the report sounded like order rather than drama, which is how I measure progress now. I met Frank's new apprentices in a bay that smelled like metal and rain and walked them through reflections, shadow directions, and the way glass and chrome betray edits. And I watched them start to see the room like a map instead of a mirror, which means they will be harder to fool by a 15-second frame. A local paper tried to bait me for a human interest piece, and I declined with a short note that said the outcome lives on paper and the lesson lives in policies, and I kept my day for the people who needed checklists rather than stories. Because attention is a budget and I am careful about what I fund. I rebuilt a small corner of the garage into a clean bench with a vise and a narrow drawer for index cards. And the drawer held extra sets of the 4 words that I hand out whenever I sense pride gathering in. A room, and I wrote at the bottom of each card a quiet line that reminds a person to call counsel before pride, because a single call can keep a season from burning. The gym chain sent another compliance packet with staff signatures and quiz scores, and a note that incidents had dropped again, and I filed it with a calm satisfaction that needs no audience. Then I drove to the bar and left a copy of my small business chain of custody guide under the counter in case a new hire ever needs it. And Pete nodded the way a man nods when he keeps a place steady without asking for thanks. On a Sunday, I organized the teaching shelf and found the first draft of my Calm Steps memo, scrawled and uneven from the week when the floor mirrors still visited my sleep. And I smiled at the smudges because they meant the work started when my hands were shaking and continued until they were not, which is the only measure I trust. The city facility asked for a second round of training, this time for supervisors, and I added a module about boundary maintenance at home because work habits decay when the house is chaos. And after the session, a manager said his team had begun to speak in numbers rather than heat during incidents. And I knew then that the method had crossed from me into a culture. I keep the case box closed under the shadow box, and I intend to leave it that way. Not because I fear reopening it, but because finished work deserves rest, and I keep waking early, stretching the shoulder that once carried a bruise, making simple food, walking the loop at dusk, and writing 3 lines for tomorrow before I lock the office door, and those lines usually sound like a promise to maintain rather than to conquer, which fits the life I want. And when I pass the gym now, I see new members learning lifts while a coach reminds them about consent signs near the mirror wall, and no one looks for a scene, and the room holds steady. And I drive on with the calm of a man whose name sits where it should, on a file that reads complete. I kept shaping the method into something that would live when I was not in the room. So I met with a school district safety team and walked them through the same 4 steps using hallways and gyms they already knew. And I watched a coach move a tense, talk away from a bench and into a wide corridor with clear cameras, and it felt like proof that calm can be taught. I updated my client templates with a small addendum that set filming rules and staff duties, and I added a quiet clause to my own, estate papers that asks any beneficiary who uses my name to follow the 4 steps in public disputes, because respect should be a family habit, not a speech, and the attorney filed the papers with neat stamps that looked like anchors. One afternoon, an online account tried a throwback frame with a sharp caption, but the platform recognized the retraction and removed it before dinner. And I added the notice to the case box without a spike of feeling, since systems now knew the shape of the truth. My team handled a lobby scene at a clinic while I was across town, and they wrote a short report with times, camera angles, and a calm summary that the risk committee praised, and I printed it as a model and placed it on the teaching shelf. A small gym that had heard about the case asked for a walkthrough, and I said yes with a clear scope and a firm boundary on publicity, and we moved 2 tripods off the main floor, posted consent reminders, and practiced coach intervention with open hands, and incident logs dipped the next month. I met Frank for coffee, and we talked about apprentices who now count a breath before they answer heat. And later I stood in a bay and watched them test sight lines by looking at reflections in steel, and I felt the simple pride that follows a plan, not a headline. At home, I kept the house quiet and useful, with bins labeled tools and records and keep, and I left the guest room made as an honest map of our boundary, and I watered a small plant on the windowsill because a living thing in a clean room teaches patience. Sometimes the memory of the mirror wall would knock on the door of my mind, and when it did, I let it sit while I traced the path from that night to the file marked complete. And by the time I reached the cabinet, the feeling had left, and only the method remained. A city office asked me to write a 1-page guide for reception desks that fear phones, and I kept it simple with 4 lines and a small box for case numbers, and the director sent it to all counters with a note that thanked us for tools, not drama. I drove past Power Forge on a late afternoon and saw a coach remind a member about consent with an easy hand, and the member nodded and lifted the tripod off the floor, without a scene. And I understood again that the best result is a room that holds steady without me. And I drove on with the steady breath that has carried me since the first lights. And I set tomorrow's 3 lines on my desk before locking the door, because peace is a plan you keep, not a mood you chase. I spent the next week turning the course into short cards that fit in a pocket, and I gave them out at job sites the way a medic gives bandages, because most scenes heal if people apply the steps early, and the reports that came back proved it, since they sounded like steady weather instead of storms. A clinic sent a note that a tense check-in moved to a bright corridor and cooled in 2 minutes. And a school wrote that a coach used open hands and a calm tone to guide a parent toward the front office where cameras watched, and both notes ended with times and names rather than feelings, which is how truth likes to travel. The gym chain mailed their quarterly packet with fewer incidents and better staff scores, and I filed it with a small line that said, "Keep the ladder strong at step 2, because intervention is the rung people skip when pride rises." I checked the platform dashboard and saw 1 more mirror removed without my asking, so I saved the notice and closed the tab. Then I cleaned the bench in my garage and set out fresh index cards for the next class, and I stood for a minute under the shadow box in the neat row of case spines and felt that quiet weight I trust more than applause. At dusk, I walked my loop and counted, a breath at each corner, and when the old scene tried to play, I let it finish and replaced it with the training room and the cards, and the noise faded, and the name remained. The next morning began with a renewal letter from the hospital network and a short note that their lobby team now speaks in times and angles instead of heat, and I filed it behind the course cards because results deserve neighbors, Then I drove to a school where a tense pickup had been moved to a bright corridor with 2 cameras and a desk witness, and the report read like weather again, calm and brief, which told me the habit had taken root. An anonymous account tried to float an old still, but the platform removed it before lunch and sent an automated notice that I printed without a spike of feeling, since systems now did the work I used to push uphill. My junior analyst called from a clinic vestibule with a shaky voice and said 2 people were filming, and I reminded him to count a breath, step back, and move the talk to the desk in view. And 10 minutes later, his report arrived with times and names and a short line that the room cooled, and I saved it as a model. I updated our SOP with a stair step that sits between disengage and document, a quiet pivot to better light with a witness. And I added the clause to client templates, so the latter is printed where eyes land. In the evening, I cleaned the bench, stocked fresh cards, reviewed compliance calendars, and wrote 3 lines for tomorrow. Follow up on training rosters, audit 2 camera zones, send 1 thank you. Then I locked the cabinet where the case box rests under the shadow box and felt the steady weight of finished work and a method that now walks without me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching?